What's up, YouTube? It's time for a review of the new Revocation record, Great Is Our Sin, out this past Friday, July 22nd. Revocation's a band that still feels pretty new to me, but in reality, they're on their 6th album now, and they've remained one of the most notable modern death metal bands since the release of Existence is Futile in 2009. Me personally, the band won me over in 2011 with their exceptional 3rd album, Chaos of Forms, which was one of my absolute favorites of that year, mostly because it embraced a wider and looser stylistic net than most of its contemporaries. Some tracks were downright thrash tunes, some sounded more like melodic death metal, some got a little techy. It was a real fun and engaging listen throughout, not to mention the guitar playing, which is out of this world. The guitar playing impressed me and thrilled me in the way that like a record like Arsis's We Are the Nightmare had previously. And also they weren't afraid to embrace quieter, clean guitar sections and the occasional sung vocal just to make everything more dynamic. But then after Chaos of Forms, I was a bit underwhelmed by the self-titled record in 2012 that followed it up. It definitely brought a bit more of an old school death metal sound at times, but still, overall, it just felt a little stale to me. The riffs and grooves didn't quite excite me or leap out of the speaker at me the way they did on Chaos of Forms. Then again, it was by no means a misstep. It definitely still sounded like Revocation, and the fans, by all accounts, definitely still liked it. Then there was Deathless in 2014, which, like its predecessor, didn't have quite as many twists and turns as I would have liked, and particularly on the first half of the record, a lot of songs did blend into each other, but it definitely redeemed itself on the second half with like some of Revocation's best songs to date, like Apex and United in Hellatry and Witch Trials. So again, not quite as multi-dimensional an experience as Chaos of Forms, but Deathless still kicked major ass, and I've remained a fan. I've remained someone who looks forward to Revocation putting out new music. And now here we are in 2016 with Great Is Our Sin. Again, it's the band's 6th album overall, first to feature drummer Ash Pearson, who used to play in 3 Inches of Blood. And I gotta say, I really dig this album. I've kind of accepted that I may not ever hear that more experimental Chaos of Forms Revocation ever again, but this record checks all the death metal boxes. It's got unrelenting aggression and intensity, tight and technically proficient musicianship, and it doesn't waste any time trying to convince you that it's anything other than what it is. Yet, it does throw in just enough curveballs to keep things a lot more interesting than the last 2 records for me. The biggest of these curveballs is actually what's by far my favorite track on the whole album, the closing number, Cleaving Giants of Ice. It's a track that begins with this beautiful, shimmering, clean guitar tone, which is actually something that's a bit scarce on this album, clean guitars, but then it gives way to a distorted verse section that alternates between these busy guitar harmonies and these big walls of chords that are backed by thunderous double bass. Then the chorus is totally unexpected. It features entirely clean vocals that sound more like something Insomnium would do, or maybe Enslaved on their Vertebrae album. It's extremely effective and gives the track that epic melodramatic vibe, which is a vibe that isn't really found anywhere else on the record, so it's refreshing by the time you get to this point. And then there's this crushing Pantera-style groove after the second chorus, and then there's one of the flashiest, most impressive guitar solos on the album. This track is just a slam dunk, from the verses to the genre-bending melodic chorus to the bridge groove to the guitar solo. It's all there. So working our way backwards a bit now from the apex of the record, there are a bunch more excellent songs on here that are worth spotlighting. The second track, Theater of Horror, is one of my very favorites because it's got some of the catchiest riffing on the entire album, particularly in the verses. These are the parts that replay over and over and over in my brain long after hearing them. And Theater of Horror is also a song that especially highlights Ash Pearson on drums, who on this track livens up these riffs by playing so many different grooves as opposed to just blasting away. He'll even switch up the grooves halfway through like the same verse section, which really gave this song this unpredictable excitement. There's also the track Crumbling Imperium, which probably has the most going on musically of any track on here. It begins with this noodly lead guitar riff that's totally contrasted by the drums and guitars that are underneath it, and from there it continues to be pretty complex. The bass pokes through for this slinky line in the first verse, and then when the guitars rejoin, the band really channel their death influence pretty heavily. What ultimately drives the track home for me, though, is the really catchy, old school sounding death metal chorus, which kind of dials back the complexity for a minute and balances things out nicely. There's also the impeccably timed clean guitar section, which once those crunchy guitars start punching through it, that is just awesome. And it does a really good job setting up that slow, stomping groove that closes the song out. And finally, there's the sick instrumental The Exaltation, which is a funny track because, at least to me, it feels like the decision to exclude vocals from this track was pretty arbitrary. Like there could have just as easily been vocals on here and there wouldn't have been a significant difference in the song. But that being said, that mid-album break from vocals is refreshing and valuable in and of itself. Not to mention, Revocation chose probably the catchiest and most memorable collection of riffs and ideas to exclude vocals from. I think my favorite part of the song might be that thrash riff that first appears like 12 seconds into the song and then recurs a bunch of times. I just think doing an instrumental in this fashion was really clever. Like they did, instead of doing like a really technical thing or like a little like minute long clean interlude like everybody else, they basically made their version of like Metallica's Orion, an instrumental metal track that doesn't need vocals to be an essential part of the album, which it is. So real quick before we move on, I gotta make sure I state the obvious here and compliment the top-notch lead guitar playing all over Great As Our Sin. The solos here are that extra ingredient that muscles up the record musically and quite frankly gives guitar players an additional element to listen for. In addition to the guitar solo on Cleaving Giants of Ice, which I already mentioned earlier, I have to shout out the first guitar solo on the Exaltation, that first guitar solo with the chromatics on the track Profanum Vulgus, and the technical but elegantly restrained solo on the track Copernican Heresy. All prime examples of what this album has to offer in the lead guitar department. Now, the next important matter to discuss with Great As Our Sin is the use of clean vocals that occurs a few times. Now, clean vocals have always had a small supporting role in Revocation music to some capacity, and on Great As Our Sin, they mostly do a good job of contributing positively and not detracting. The track Monolithic Ignorance uses cleans really briefly in this industrial, robotic kind of way for the chorus. I thought that was badass as hell. There's of course the epic chorus in Cleaving Giants of Ice, which I already praised. In the song Profanum Vulgus, there's a bridge section with these clean vocals that sound like a combination of Opeth and Ghost. But then as the song builds, they become more Gojira-like. I thought this whole section was tasteful as hell and helpful in expanding the song. Unfortunately, the one track I really can't speak highly of in the clean vocal department is the opening track, Arbiters of the Apocalypse. Just the way this one is structured with the barked verse and the singing chorus, it just left a bad taste in my mouth because it had the vibe of like a generic new wave of American heavy metal or metalcore song. And I'm not going to say that Arbiters is a bad track by any means because it's not, but that whole scream-sing trade-off really stepped outside of this album's strong suits, if you ask me. And now that we're kind of on the topic, no, Great As Our Sin is not a perfect album. You got the fifth track on here, Communion, which is one of the more lifeless moments on the record, which, maybe to be fair, is because it's sandwiched in between Crumbling Imperium and The Exaltation, two of the record's best songs, but still, it's a fairly forgettable thrash and death metal hybrid, and when it ends, the way it kind of slides right into The Exaltation with no change of mood, it's almost like you wouldn't even notice you were listening to a new song unless you were paying attention to the track list. I also don't like the track Only the Spineless Survive. Riff-wise, I found myself bored to tears with this one, particularly in the first half. I really didn't care for that mid-paced chug riff in the verses. It sounds like knockoff Kill-era Cannibal Corpse. And then the outro riff is just so sluggish and definitely takes the cake for most boring on all 10 tracks here. Just really a filler track to me. But overall, despite a few drawbacks, I hope I've made it clear that Great As Our Sin is a powerful record with lots to offer in terms of intricacy, brutality, memorable melodies, and a bit of nuance too. This record may not capture my heart in the way that Chaos of Forms did, but Revocation are still unquestionably at the front of the death metal pack in 2016, and this is definitely their strongest batch of songs since Chaos, if you ask me. So if you're a death metal guy or you're looking to get into death metal, this record comes highly recommended. Great As Our Sin gets an 8 out of 10 from me, As always, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, or shoot me a message so we can continue to talk music, and I'll see you guys soon.